Today is September the 10th. In order to prepare AP US history, we organize this debate program where today's topic is to debate what is the cause of the Civil War. Is it about slavery or not? Go ahead.
Okay, so as the affirming side, I believe that the cause of the Civil War was because of slavery. Now, my main points are that slavery was the largest force that drove forth the Civil War. The Civil War Trust, the largest nonprofit organization preserving American battlefields and history, stated, quote, "The Confederate States of America, a collection of 11 southern states that left the Union in 1960 and 1961, were formed their own country in order to protect the institution of slavery. Slavery was almost the backbone of their agricultural economy, and they could not allow it to be threatened by the Union and their beliefs that slavery should be abolished. So basically, this caused a civil war as their opposing ideas caused them to have conflict between them and brought forth the idea of the Civil War. And as the Confederates' main goal was to protect the slavery, as the quote stated, when the North fought with them, they were basically fighting over the concept of slavery. Now, also, slavery led to other major topics in the Civil War. Debate over slavery was a large point that led to the secession, with more northern states abolishing slavery, and as the United States expands westward, with many people debating if slavery should be permitted in those new states or not, southern states felt a bit threatened by the giant shift that may largely end slavery. Now, again, secession was mainly because the South disagreeing with the North. The slavery was a large part of the Southern lifestyle, because with 1 in every 3 person being a slave in the South, being African American in the South, that meant a large amount of their population was brought forth by slavery. Also, Henry Louis Gates Jr., director of the Hutchins Center for African American Research at Harvard University, stated how agriculture was an enormous part of their economy, with cash crops such as cotton and tobacco being needed with a large amount of manual labor. And at that time, slaves were the cheapest form of labor. If they wanted to preserve their agricultural economy, which is basically their entire economy, they had to protect slavery, and they can only do so by fighting in the Civil War, by supporting and by trying to save their institution of having slavery. And also, another point is that as cotton trade increased, the slave population also increased by an average of 27.5% per decade. This showed that a large amount of slaves made up their population, also that they needed to keep importing slaves in order to continue the lifestyles they had, in order to continue the economy that they have, and they can only do so by supporting the slaves in the Civil War. Also, the Southern secession was a huge part of the Civil War, and it can be said that the Union fought the war to reunite the states in order to preserve our nation, but this secession was perpetuated by the slavery, as I have shown. Also, L.S.E. Richard, the Union at Risk, Jacksonian Democracy, States Rights, and the Nullification Act of 1987 showed how after the nullification crisis occurred with the usage of states' rights doctrines, they challenged the power of the federal government. However, these states' rights doctrines were later used by pro-slavery people in order to try to get the federal government to allow them to continue building the slaves. So even though this Nullification Act was largely thought of as the counter-argument to the fact that slavery was not the largest part in the Civil War, it actually disproves that, because the Nullification Act showed how it later led to the increased talks in slavery, because basically the people who were pro-slaves, they used the nullification crisis situation, and then they took the idea of using the state doctrines and supported themselves with the idea. That's all.
Okay, so I am the negating side. I am against her statement of slavery being the main reason why the Civil War happened. My argument is that the Civil War is about states' rights rather than slavery. Some evidence shows is that the North isn't actually fully against slavery. They were 100% stating that they wanted to abolish slavery. Unlike certain groups, only certain groups wanted to abolish slavery completely. But the entire North as a whole, including Abraham Lincoln himself, were not against slavery itself. He himself says, "I will say then that I am not, nor ever have been, in favor of bringing about in any way the social and political equality of the white and black races." This basically means that Abraham Lincoln was never trying to bring two races together by making the slaves not slaves and making them full citizens. That wasn't his intention from the first place. In fact, the reason why the South left was because of the states' rights, because it was a debate between the Union and the Confederate States, who were slave states. They were arguing about the ability to keep slaves. That's the argument that they were mostly debating on. Because if the North really wanted to end slavery, they had no reason to wait until secessions occurred. So technically, they would have been able to end slavery before secession even occurred, which means that which points to the which provides evidence that slavery isn't the main issue. It's one of them. It isn't the main issue. States' rights. So there was actually an amendment that the House of Congress supported. It was an amendment to allow the South to remain slave states. It was actually publicly supported by Abraham Lincoln and the House of Congress. It would actually constitutionally protect slavery in the South. Since the North wanted to keep since the North wanted to keep a mainly centralized government, which basically means like a strong government with with state powers being relatively weaker than the federal power. So the North wanted to keep this amendment instead of abolishing slavery, because if they had abolished slavery, then this amendment would have been revoked in a sense. Another main point of the Civil War was for the Union to keep the states, all the states in one country, rather than have it split into like a union and then a confederacy of South states. President Lincoln during the war wasn't an abolitionist either, as he said with the quote that he has never been in favor of the social and political equality of the white and black races. He actually supports some aspects of slavery that exist, including the fact that blacks and whites were not equal. Whites have certain rights that the African Americans don't, and Lincoln has admitted that he doesn't know how to directly approach the topic of slavery in another speech. One popular speech that he made is the Emancipation Proclamation, which explains that. What's the word? It allows slaves in the North to be considered free. The real purpose of the speeches was not to provide slaves with access to citizenship in the North. It was to actually give the slaves an option to leave the South, which would demoralize the South and make winning the war of keeping the states together. It would make the war easier.
Okay, the rebuttals. So the first round is statement. The second round is rebuttal. Then everything is recorded. So just conduct yourself very professionally. So even though it's not 100% prepared, but your job is harder. But anyway, your rebuttal for
My rebuttal? Okay.
Yeah. Find out his point and the big point. And then go ahead. Just go.
Wait, do you want this like a question or just like going down?
It's rebuttal, not question.
Yeah, rebuttal. Not cross-examination. She's not ready.
Actually, with your whole point, I feel like one of the largest ideas you presented with us was the idea that basically Lincoln and the Northerners were not against slavery. So actually, there's something that goes against that, where there's a theory, there is a concept where the Northerns and especially Lincoln had an idea where their views on colonization, they believe that actually slaves should be freed. However, what they plan with the slaves, they believe that the slaves should, they do believe the slaves should be freed, but they actually,
It's okay.
I'm trying to. Wait, hold on. This one. There's, I'm trying to think of like how to word this because I feel like I'm gonna word it in a way. Yeah, it's kind of long. Okay, so there's a concept where people believe that Lincoln and the Northerners actually did want to free the slaves, but their reasons were basically, okay, actually I'm going to so the North basically, the reason why they seem to not care too much about the slaves is basically because they have a smaller slave population, which means it's less vital to their economy than the South. The South instead has a larger slave population. Therefore, because it is so vital to them and it makes up the backbone of their agriculture economy, it shows how their differentiating views on the topic of slaves brought forth the Civil War, as they have opposing ideas. Opposing ideas usually bring forth conflict, and this conflict can be shown because as they have different opposing views, the North, who believes since their economy doesn't even rely on the slaves that much, don't have as much value in having slaves, with the South actually valuing the slaves because it makes up their entire agriculture economy. And as I've shown, 1 out of 3 people in the South were African American. It shows how they may not see it as vital to them as the South. And this led forth basically how the secession mainly occurred because the South felt largely, they disagreed with a large amount of what the North said, especially with the whole Nullification Act occurring. However, that Nullification Act is related to slavery. It's not just about states' rights, because the Nullification Act used state right doctrines. And these doctrines are later used, they were always used to challenge the power of the federal government. However, later these pro-slavery people in the South, they use these state doctrines and use it to try to further their agenda with the slaves and try to further the usage of slaves and allow them to grow the use of using the slaves. And the North didn't agree. This is why it perpetuated the conflict between them and why it perpetuated the Civil War to continue. And so it's not just a state right point of topic.
Your turn.
Okay, so you mentioned that the South has a 1 in 3. You mentioned that the population in the South consisted of about 1/3 African American, which basically indicates that 1/3 of the entire population is slaves, and that the South relies more on agricultural-based economy rather than the North's industrialized economy. So the North, and you also mentioned that the North is opposed to slavery. Was that what you said? Yeah, the North wasn't necessarily opposed to slavery. In fact, Abraham Lincoln himself stated that he wasn't in favor of the social and political equality of the white and black races. He wasn't focused on that. What happened was the reason that South Carolina was like the first state to leave the Union was because of the federal versus state powers, like the balance of the two powers. Because the states wanted certain things, like certain rules in regards to slavery. They were the rights that the states wanted to grant themselves were related to slavery, but what was more important was the fact that the government, the federal powers, were more powerful than the states, so they could automatically revoke whatever the South or the states wanted to do. So that's why the South wanted to leave, because they were against the federal the government being stronger than the state itself. And because Lincoln, he wanted to preserve this centralized government, but the South states didn't want that because that would bring conflict with the way they want to set up their rights in each state. And actually, again, it says the federal government actually proposed an amendment to keep slavery in the South. So that indicates that that slavery wasn't the main issue between the North and the South. It was the fact that the Confederates, after they left, didn't want to join the Union again because of the federal and state conflict with their ideas and the type of governments they have. Yeah.
Okay, let's stop here.
Wait, there was one concept I tried bringing up, but then I felt like phrasing it